The Barzan executioner's energy pistol flashed. The human child's scream cut short as her body vaporized into ash. Her death would be avenged in the fires of total war. Aboard the UES Retribution, patrolling the fringes of human space, veteran Space Marine Douglas Simmons meticulously cleaned his plasma rifle. Doug sat in the armory, chatting quietly with squad mate Mike about upcoming shore leave. Suddenly, klaxons blared. The ship AI announced detection of an unidentified vessel on intercept course. Racing onto the bridge, the Marines saw it was a Barzan ship. Humanity had a tense but peaceful relationship with that species. The Barzan vessel hailed them. On the view screen appeared Zephyr, a high-ranking Barzan that Doug recognized from prior negotiations. Zephyr arrogantly proclaimed the Barzan Empire deemed humanity's expansion a threat. He declared the human Proxima 3 colony would be annexed. Any resistance would meet overwhelming force. To demonstrate Barzan military superiority, Zephyr coldly ordered a human prisoner's execution, a terrified 6-year-old girl. The Marines watched in horror as Zephyr drew his sidearm and disintegrated the shrieking child on screen. Incandescent with rage, the human captain demanded answers. Zephyr sneered it was retribution for human defiance, then cut the transmission. Stunned silence filled the bridge at the brutality they witnessed. Doug slammed his fist on the wall, snarling through gritted teeth. "They want hell, let's show them hell." The Retribution's engines burned hotter than the sun, rushing headlong into peril. The ship tore through space, desperate to defend their brothers and sisters in Proxima 3 before it was too late. Captain Johnson's voice boomed over the comms in the ready room. Doug and his squad stood at full attention as their leader laid out the mission. "Marines, Intel has Zephyr himself overseeing the annexation from a command center on the planet's surface. Our job is to infiltrate the facility and disable the defense grid so the fleet can land. I won't lie to you. The Barzans outgun and outnumber us, but we've got a new toy, an experimental cloaking device, that should get us planet-side unseen. It's do-or-die time. Humanity is counting on us." Suddenly alarms shrieked as the ship shuddered under Doug's boots. A crewman shouted over the din. "Barzan patrol ship off the port bow. They just dropped out of warp right on top of us." The deck plates rattled as the first plasma blasts struck the Retribution's shields. Captain Johnson barked orders. "Activate the cloaking device now, and someone get me a damage report." The cloaking device hummed to life and the ship vanished from view. The Barzan patrol ceased fire, unable to target the invisible human vessel. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crew, but it was short-lived. "Captain, we have a problem. That power surge from the cloak fried the landing systems. We can't safely set down on the planet." Johnson cursed under his breath. Time was running out. Then his eyes fell on the drop pod bay. "Orbital insertion, it's the only way." Doug and his squad loaded into single-occupant drop pods, cramped metal coffins designed to deliver a Marine from orbit to ground at breakneck speed. It was a risky deployment method, reserved for only the direst of situations. This certainly qualified. As Doug strapped himself in, he pictured his pod as a fiery fist of retribution, hurtling down to avenge the fallen. His jaw clenched with determination as the pod blasted free from the Retribution, blazing a trail through the void towards Proxima 3 far below. The battle for the planet, for the future of humanity itself, was about to begin, and Doug would be the tip of the spear. Doug's body slammed against the restraints as the drop pod hurtled through the upper atmosphere. Flames engulfed the pod, the ceramic ablative skin glowing white-hot as it shed velocity. The pod shook violently, rattling Doug's teeth. He watched the altimeter spin down as the pod plummeted towards the surface of Proxima 3. At 5,000 meters, the retro thrusters should have fired, slowing the pod's descent for a controlled landing. Doug braced himself for the expected jolt of deceleration. It never came. Warning alarms blared as only 3 of the 4 thrusters ignited, sending the pod into a wild spin. The pod careened out of control, slamming into the ground at a steep angle and burying itself halfway into the dirt. The impact knocked the air from Doug's lungs, and stars danced across his vision. Ears ringing and head pounding, Doug fumbled with the harness release. The pod door was jammed, wedged into the ground. Doug kicked at it once, twice, 3 times before it finally gave way, swinging open with a tortured metal screech. He hauled himself out, grabbing his rifle and gear, and stumbled away from the wreckage. Bringing up his HUD, Doug tried to orient himself. The crash landing had thrown him kilometers off course. There was no sign of the rest of his squad. Before he could activate his locator beacon, his radio crackled to life. "All units, this is Captain Johnson. Rendezvous at the ravine at coordinates Delta Foxtrot 9er. Acknowledge." "Simmons here, on my way, Captain," Doug replied. He checked his rifle and set off into the dense alien jungle, all senses on high alert for Barzan patrols. Doug pushed through the thick undergrowth, the humid air heavy in his lungs. Strange animal calls echoed through the trees. After hiking for over an hour, he finally reached the designated ravine. He expected to find his squad mates waiting for him. Instead, he found a scene of utter devastation. The ravine floor was littered with the twisted, shattered remains of drop pods. Torn shreds of bloody uniforms and bits of scorched gear were strewn among the wreckage. It was clear an ambush had occurred, and it had been brutally one-sided. Doug's blood ran cold as he realized his entire squad was likely dead or captured. He was now alone, deep in hostile territory. Doug cautiously picked his way through the debris field, looking for any sign of survivors. He activated his locator beacon, hoping against hope for a response from a squad mate. The beacon pinged forlornly, unanswered. Suddenly a twig snapped behind him. Doug whirled, bring his plasma rifle to bear. There, not 10 meters away, stood a Barzan soldier, an energy pistol aimed squarely at Doug's head. Doug's eyes widened in recognition. It was Zephyr himself, the sadistic alien commander responsible for the murder of the human child. "So even primitive apes can learn tricks," Zephyr sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Pity it won't save your world." A massive beast burst from the undergrowth, all teeth and claws and primal fury. It charged straight at Zephyr, faster than anything that size should move. Zephyr tried to turn and flee, but he was far too slow. The creature pounced, its powerful jaws clamping down on the Barzan's torso with a sickening crunch. Doug watched in mute horror as the creature shook Zephyr's broken body like a rag doll before tossing him aside. The Barzan commander landed in a crumpled heap, unmoving. Slowly, the beast turned, fixing Doug with a baleful, predatory gaze. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a promise of violence, and stalked towards him. The beast's claws scythed through the air, a blur of razor-sharp talons. Doug hurled himself sideways, the deadly swipe missing him by a hair's breadth. He hit the ground rolling, his plasma rifle already up and firing. Searing bolts of energy streaked towards the creature, but it moved with blinding speed, its sinuous body twisting and contorting to avoid the blasts. Doug had barely regained his footing before the beast was upon him again, its maw gaping, filled with rows of serrated teeth. He tried to dodge, but this time he was a fraction too slow. The creature's claws raked across his side, shredding through his armor like paper. White-hot agony exploded through him, and he felt himself lifted off his feet by the force of the blow, his rifle flying from his grasp. He slammed into the ground, the breath driven from his lungs. Blood poured from the deep furrows in his flesh. Gasping, he rolled onto his stomach and clawed at the dirt, trying desperately to crawl away, but there was nowhere to go. The beast loomed over him, its fetid breath hot on the back of his neck. Doug's hand scrabbled frantically across the ground, searching for something, anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against something hard, and he grabbed it without thinking. It was a rock, jagged and heavy in his fist. The creature pounced, its vast bulk blotting out the sun. With a roar of defiance and desperation, Doug rolled onto his back and swung the rock with every ounce of strength left in his battered body. It connected with the side of the beast's skull with a sickening crunch. The creature reeled back, momentarily stunned. Adrenaline surging through his veins, Doug lunged for his fallen rifle. His blood-slicked fingers closed around the grip, and he brought it up, squeezing the trigger again and again until the power cell ran dry. Plasma bolts ripped into the creature's underbelly, burning through hide and flesh and bone. It let out a final agonized bellow and crashed to the ground, its body charring and smoking. Doug let his rifle fall from his nerveless fingers. His vision swam, and he could feel the warm, sticky flow of blood soaking his shredded armor. Summoning the last dregs of his strength, he dragged himself over to Zephyr's body, praying the Barzan commander had a med kit, a comm device, anything that could help him. As he rifled through Zephyr's pockets with trembling hands, something caught his eye, a glint of metal in the Barzan's clenched fist. Doug pried the stiffening fingers apart to reveal a data chip, ornate and clearly important. He slotted it into his own personal data device, hoping against hope it contained something useful. The device whirred and a hologram sprang to life, revealing detailed schematics of the Barzan command center. There, highlighted in pulsing red, was the location of the planetary defense controls, the key to their mission, to humanity's survival, right in front of him. But as Doug scrolled through the files, his heart turned to ice in his chest. Log after log detailing atrocities, massacres, entire species wiped out on the orders of the Barzan High Command, and Zephyr's leering face in everyone, carrying out the brutal orders with glee. This was no one-off act of cruelty, but part of a systematic campaign of genocide, aimed at snuffing out any race that might threaten Barzan supremacy. Rage, white-hot and all-consuming, burned through Doug's veins, momentarily numbing the agony of his wounds. He copied the data with shaking fingers and tucked the chip away. This was the evidence they needed to bring the Barzans to their knees, to rally the galaxy against their atrocities. But first he had a job to do. Gritting his teeth, Doug pushed himself to his feet, swaying drunkenly. He tore strips from his ruined armor to bandage the worst of his wounds, then retrieved his rifle. The Barzan command center awaited, and he would make them pay for every innocent life they'd taken, even if it cost him his own. Steadying himself with a deep breath, ignoring the blood dripping down his side, Doug set off into the jungle once more, his stride unwavering, his purpose clear. The Barzans had sown the seeds of their own destruction, and Doug would be the harbinger of humanity's retribution, no matter the cost. Doug crept through the dense jungle undergrowth, his senses on high alert. The schematics from Zephyr's data chip guided his path as he dodged Barzan patrols and surveillance drones with painstaking care. Every step sent shockwaves of pain rippling through his battered body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed onward. Hours passed in a blur of sweat, blood and exhaustion before the Barzan command center finally came into view. It was a fortress of gleaming metal and brutal efficiency, all high walls and crackling energy barriers. Guard towers loomed above, bristling with enough firepower to reduce an army to ash. But then there, a flicker of shadow, a break in the pattern. A small drainage tunnel, half hidden behind a tangle of vines. Doug double-checked the schematics. This entry point wasn't marked. Likely a last-minute addition, and one the Barzans didn't expect anyone to find. He waited, muscles coiled until the patrols had passed. Then, with a burst of speed, he bolted for the tunnel. The narrow passage forced him to crawl on his belly, the rough concrete tearing at his wounds. The tight walls pressed in, threatening to crush him. Doug's heart hammered in his ears, every ragged breath an eternity. After a small forever, Doug finally emerged into a cramped maintenance area deep within the compound. He consulted the data chip once more, committing the route to the control room to memory. But the path led through a heavily guarded corridor, swarming with Barzan soldiers. Checkpoints and kill zones transformed it into a brutal gauntlet. Charging in alone would be suicide. Desperation and tactics warred in Doug's mind, until his gaze fell upon a humming power relay. The cables snaking from it pulsed with energy, the lifeblood of the compound's defenses. If he could sever that artery, even for a moment, it would unleash chaos, the perfect diversion. With careful, deliberate motions, Doug prepped a timed charge and affixed it to the relay. He retreated to a shadowed alcove near the control room corridor and readied his rifle. Everything hinged on split-second timing. The charge detonated with a percussive thud. Lights died and alarms wailed as the compound plunged into darkness. Panicked shouts and thudding boots echoed from all directions. Doug's mental clock counted down. 3, 2, 1. Emergency power surged to life, casting a hellish red glow. Doug exploded from cover, a vengeful wraith wreathed in shadow and fury. The first guards died before they even realized the threat, dispatched with ruthless efficiency. But the corridor was long, and the Barzans were many. As Doug surged forward, the alarm was raised. Plasma fire lit the gloom, searing the air and forcing him to weave and roll. Doug returned fire on the move, his rifle spitting sun-bright death. They swarmed him from all sides, but Doug was a maelstrom of desperate skill and iron will. He made them pay in blood for every inch of ground, never slowing, never stopping. Plasma scorched his armor, burned his flesh, but he barely felt it. His focus was absolute, his purpose undeniable. One by one his enemies fell, until finally Doug stood alone and panting before the control room blast door. He staggered forward, riding the battle high, reaching for the entry panel. An agony exploded through him, sudden and searing. Doug looked down to see a charred hole punched clean through his side, weeping blood and smoke. His legs buckled, and suddenly the door seemed impossibly distant, but he could not stop, would not stop. Sucking ragged breaths through clenched teeth, Doug dragged himself hand over hand towards his goal. His vision tunneled, the edges graying out, until all he could see was the door and the crimson trail he left behind. With the last of his strength, Doug hauled himself up to the control room's entrance, leaving a slick trail of blood in his wake. He slammed his palm against the access panel, his hand slipping as he smeared it with crimson. The door hissed open, and he stumbled inside. The room spun before his eyes, a kaleidoscope of flashing lights and blaring alarms. At its center stood a circular console, a holographic display floating above it, casting an eerie glow. Doug staggered towards it, his vision tunneling. Impressive for a primitive, but ultimately futile. The cold, mocking voice cut through the haze of pain. Doug spun, reaching for his rifle, but his blood-slicked fingers fumbled on the grip. A towering figure stood in the doorway, clad in heavy Barzan armor, a crackling energy blade in his hand. General Karzod, Zephyr's right hand, the architect of 1,000 atrocities. Karzod moved with blinding speed, his blade slashing through the air. It cleaved through Doug's rifle, severing it in two. The ruined weapon clattered to the floor. Doug reached for his sidearm, but Karzod was already on him. The energy blade flashed, biting deep into Doug's thigh. Agony seared through him and his leg buckled, sending him crashing to the floor. Karzod loomed over him, his blade humming with deadly power. "Your species is weak, human, unfit to exist in our galaxy." Karzod's voice dripped with contempt. "I will take great pleasure in overseeing your extinction, starting with you." Doug's hand scrabbled over the console, desperate for anything that could help. His fingers brushed a large red button. Without hesitation, he slammed his palm down on it. Sirens wailed and lights flashed red. A robotic voice announced, "Planetary defense systems offline, all orbital weapons platforms disengaged." Karzod roared in fury. He lunged, his blade arcing towards Doug's throat, but Doug, in a final desperate surge of strength, propelled himself forward, inside Karzod's reach. He grappled with the Barzan, gripping his blade arm with both hands. They struggled, locked in a deadly embrace. Doug's muscles screamed in agony as he pitted his waning strength against Karzod's rage. In a last, desperate gambit, Doug twisted, using Karzod's own momentum against him. Karzod's blade, still gripped in his hand, plunged into his own chest. The Barzan's eyes widened in shock. He staggered back, dark blood pouring from the wound. With a final gurgling breath, he collapsed to the floor, his life ebbing away. Doug crawled to the console, his vision graying at the edges. With a shaking, blood-slicked hand, he activated the comms. "This is Sergeant Douglas Simmons, UES Retribution. Mission accomplished. Planetary defenses are down, requesting immediate extraction." His message sent, Doug slumped to the floor, his strength finally spent. As consciousness faded, the sound of distant explosions and the roar of human dropships filled the air. Pain. That was the first thing Doug felt as consciousness slowly returned, a deep, all-encompassing ache that seemed to radiate from every fiber of his being. He groaned, his eyelids fluttering open, squinting against the harsh, fluorescent light. The steady beep of a heart monitor filled his ears, the antiseptic smell of a hospital room invading his nostrils. As his vision cleared, he took stock of his surroundings. He was in a hospital bed, his body a patchwork of bandages and healing wounds. The battle on Proxima 3 had left its mark, a testament to the brutality of his mission and the lengths he had gone to secure victory. A figure stood at his bedside, and as Doug's eyes focused, he recognized the familiar face of Captain Johnson. The older man's expression was a mix of relief and respect, his eyes shining with pride as he looked down at Doug. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Sergeant," Johnson said, his voice warm. "You gave us quite a scare." Doug tried to speak, his throat dry and scratchy. Johnson held up a hand, silencing him. "Easy, soldier, you've been through hell. The docs say you're lucky to be alive." Johnson pulled up a chair, settling in next to the bed. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression turning serious. "What you did down there, Simmons, it turned the tide of the battle. With the planetary defenses down, our fleet was able to land troops and secure key installations with minimal casualties. The Barzans, with their command structure in disarray after the loss of Zephyr and Karzod, were quickly overwhelmed. Proxima 3 is now under human control." Doug felt a surge of emotion at the news, a mix of relief and grief. His actions had helped secure victory, but at what cost? His squadron, his friends, were gone, their lives given in service to humanity's cause. Johnson seemed to sense his thoughts, his hand coming to rest on Doug's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. "Your squad's sacrifice was not in vain, Doug. They died as heroes, and their memory will be honored." Doug nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. He knew Johnson was right, but it didn't ease the ache in his heart. "But the war is far from over," Johnson continued, his tone turning grim. "Intel recovered from the Barzan Command Center has revealed the location of a major Barzan shipyard. They're building a fleet of advanced warships designed specifically to counter our technology. If those ships are completed, they could turn the tide of the war back in the Barzan's favor." Doug felt a chill run down his spine at the news. After all they had sacrificed, all they had endured, the thought of the Barzans regaining the upper hand was unbearable. "High Command is planning a daring raid to destroy the shipyard," Johnson said, his eyes locking with Doug's, "and they want you to lead it." He opened his mouth to protest, to say that he wasn't ready, that he needed time to heal. But the words died on his lips. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't sit this fight out. Too much was at stake. The fate of humanity, of every man, woman, and child, rested on the outcome of this war. As Johnson left to make preparations, Doug reached into the pocket of his hospital gown, his fingers closing around the data chip he had taken from Zephyr's corpse. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hands, the weight of the information it contained heavy on his mind. The atrocities detailed within, the systematic brutality of the Barzan regime, weighed on him like a physical burden. He knew this information could be crucial in swaying neutral species to the human cause, in painting the Barzans as the monsters they truly were. But part of him, the part that had seen the life fade from that innocent child's eyes, wanted to keep it secret, to bear the burden of that knowledge alone, a silent tribute to the lives lost. He shook his head, banishing the thought. That wasn't what a soldier did. That wasn't what his squad would have wanted. With a sigh, he handed the chip to Johnson as the captain returned, entrusting him to get it to the right people. As Johnson left, Doug turned his focus to the mission ahead. He called up intelligence reports and ship schematics on his datapad, his mind already racing, formulating a plan. He was battered and bruised, his body a map of scars and healing wounds, but his resolve had never been stronger. The Barzans would pay for what they had done, and Doug would make sure of it. Weeks later, Doug stands on the bridge of the UES Retribution, now fully healed and clad in his battle armor. Around him, The bridge buzzes with activity as the ship prepares for the assault on the Barzan shipyard. Doug studies the holographic display of the shipyard, a massive, sprawling complex orbiting a gas giant. It's heavily defended, with layers of energy shields, weapon platforms, and patrol ships. But Doug has a plan. "Listen up," Doug says, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We're going to approach under cloak, using the gas giant's magnetic field to mask our signature. Once we're in range, my team and I will EVA over to the shipyard and plant explosives at these key structural points." He points to several glowing nodes on the hologram. "Meanwhile, Team 2 will infiltrate the control center and sabotage the defenses from within. Once the charges are set and the defenses are down, the Retribution will decloak and launch a full assault, joined by our bomber squadron. Our goal is to destroy those new Barzan warships before they can launch." Doug looks around at the faces of his crew, seeing a mix of determination and apprehension. "I won't lie to you, it's a risky plan, but it's our best chance. We can't let those ships get operational. Too much is at stake." As the Retribution nears the gas giant, Doug and his team suit up in the armory, checking their weapons and gear with practiced efficiency. There's a tense silence, each man and woman knowing the weight of the task ahead. Doug's mind flashes to his fallen squadmates, to the child Zephyr murdered in cold blood. A cold determination settles over him like a shroud. He will not fail, not this time. The Retribution reaches its insertion point, and Doug and his team move to the airlock. As the outer door slides open, revealing the swirling clouds of the gas giant below and the glittering expanse of the shipyard ahead, Doug takes a deep breath, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then, with a nod to his team, he steps out into the void, propelling himself towards the shipyard, his team close behind. They move silently through space, using their suit thrusters to navigate towards a maintenance airlock on the shipyard's outer hull. Suddenly, the space around them is alive with energy beams as shipyard defenses open fire. Doug and his team scatter, taking evasive action, jetting and rolling to avoid the deadly onslaught. Over the comms, Doug hears the voice of the Retribution's captain, strained and urgent. "Simmons, we've been betrayed. The Barzans were waiting for us. Team 2 has been captured and we're under heavy fire. We have to abort the mission." Doug's blood runs cold. They've been set up. The Retribution is taking a pounding, its cloak and shield straining under the barrage. Gritting his teeth, Doug makes a decision. They've come too far to turn back now. With a barked order to his team over the comm, he jets towards the shipyard, dodging and weaving through the hail of fire. "We're going to complete this mission," he growls, "even if it costs us our lives. For the UES for the Fallen, failure is not an option." His team responds with a chorus of determined affirmations, following his lead as they streak towards the shipyard, energy beams crisscrossing the space around them. It's a desperate gambit, but it's all they have left. Doug's focus narrows to a single point, all his training, all his skill brought to bear on this one crucial moment. The fate of humanity hangs in the balance, and he will not let it fall. The hull of the Barzan shipyard buckled and tore as Doug and his team breached through, the shriek of rending metal drowned out by the blare of alarms. They tumbled into a dimly lit maintenance corridor, the sudden influx of air tugging at them before emergency bulkheads slammed down, sealing the breach. Doug rolled to his feet, his suit's readouts flashing warnings across his HUD. He glanced around at his team as they picked themselves up. They were all accounted for, but their EVA suits were in bad shape. Jagged tears leaked precious oxygen, and the air recyclers whined with the strain. They had minutes of air left at best. "We press on," Doug said over the team comm, his voice tight with tension. "No way back to the Retribution now. We complete the mission, no matter the cost." Grim nods answered him. They all knew what was at stake. They pushed deeper into the shipyard's labyrinthine interior, the corridors twisting and turning. Barzan soldiers seemed to pour from every junction and doorway, plasma fire filling the air. Doug and his team fought for every inch, their own weapons flaring, the tight confines of the corridors turning each firefight into a brutal, close-quarters brawl. Smoke choked the air and the deck grew slick with blood, both human and Barzan, but they pushed forward, leaving a trail of fallen enemies in their wake. At key structural points they planted their charges, the timers ticking down. But their progress was too slow, their air supplies dwindling with every passing second. As they neared the main reactor, Doug's comm crackled with a desperate transmission from the Retribution. "Heavy damage. Barzan boarders on all decks. We can't—" The transmission cut to static, but the message was clear. The Retribution was falling. Doug clenched his jaw, a cold certainty settling over him. He turned to his team. "Get to the escape pods. Evacuate while you still can." "What about you, sir?" one of them asked, though the look in their eyes said they already knew the answer. "I'm going for the reactor. I can overload it, take out the whole shipyard and the Barzan fleet with it, but it's a one-way trip." "That's an order, soldier." Doug's voice was steel. "This is my responsibility. Now go before it's too late." Reluctantly, with last looks of respect and sorrow, his team peeled off, heading for the escape pods. Doug watched them go, then turned, steeling himself for the final push. The way to the reactor control room was a gauntlet of fire and blood. Barzan soldiers swarmed him, their weapons tearing at his suit, searing his flesh. But Doug was a man possessed, driven by a singular purpose. He fought like a demon, his rifle blazing until its power cell ran dry. Then he used it as a club, smashing his way through. By the time he reached the control room, his suit was in tatters, his body a map of burns and lacerations. But he was alive, and the controls for the reactor loomed before him. He staggered to the console, his blood-slicked fingers dancing over the keys as he initiated the overload sequence. Warnings flashed and alarms blared, the reactor's whine rising to a deafening crescendo. Just as he was about to input the final command, a shadow detached itself from the far wall. Doug spun, his hand dropping to his sidearm, and froze in shock. It was Karzod. The Barzan general was a ruin, his armor shattered, his flesh seared, but his eyes burned with unquenchable hate. Impossible. Doug had seen him die on Proxima III. Karzod laughed, a wet gurgling sound. "Surprised, human? The Barzan have many secrets. Cloning is just one of them. You may have killed one of me, but there are always more." He raised his weapon, a crackling energy blade, and charged. Doug met him head-on, slamming into the Barzan with the force of a charging bull. They crashed to the deck, grappling, trading blows that would have shattered bone. But Doug was weakened, his injuries sapping his strength. Karzod rolled on top of him, his hands clamping around Doug's throat, squeezing with crushing force. Black spots danced across Doug's vision as he scrabbled desperately at his belt, his fingers closing around the hilt of his combat knife. With a last, defiant roar, he plunged the blade deep into Karzod's eye socket. The Barzan reared back, howling in agony, and Doug heaved him off, staggering to the console. He slammed his fist down on the control, feeling something crack in his hand, not caring. The overload initiated, the reactor's whine becoming a scream. Doug slumped against the console, his strength spent. He looked down at Karzod's body, knowing this was just one clone, that there were more out there, that the real fight was still to come. But for now he had won. The mission was complete. As the reactor reached critical, Doug closed his eyes, his thoughts turning to his fallen comrades, to the sacrifices they had all made, to the billions of lives on Earth that he had sworn to protect. A smile touched his lips. It had been an honor to serve. The reactor went supercritical, a blinding flash of light consuming the shipyard, the Barzan fleet and the lone human soldier who had made it all possible. The reactor's explosion consumed the Barzan shipyard in a blinding flash, the shockwave rippling out through the void. On the bridge of the battered UES Retribution, the crew erupted into cheers as the shipyard and its fleet of deadly warships vanished from the scanners, reduced to scattered atoms. But the celebration was short-lived, tempered by the knowledge of the cost of this victory. In the weeks that followed, the tide of the war began to turn. The loss of the shipyard was a blow the Barzan struggled to recover from, their military infrastructure crippled. Human forces, armed with the damning evidence from Zephyr's data chip, launched a series of bold offensives, systematically dismantling the Barzan's hold on occupied worlds. On planet after planet, human troops landed, engaging Barzan forces in brutal ground combat. They fought street to street, building to building, the once pristine cityscapes transformed into rubble-strewn battlefields. Plasma fire lit the night, the screams of the wounded and dying filling the air. But with each hard-fought victory, enslaved populations were liberated, the extent of Barzan atrocities laid bare for all to see. Footage of mass graves, of torture chambers and experimentation facilities spread across the Galactic news networks, sparking outrage and revulsion. Support for the human cause swelled, with formerly neutral species now openly condemning the Barzan Empire. Diplomatic ties were severed, trade embargoes enacted. The Barzans found themselves increasingly isolated, their once mighty empire crumbling around them. Yet even in retreat, they remained deadly. Their use of cloning technology meant that defeated commanders like Kar-Zod returned to the front lines again and again, their tactics adapting, growing more ruthless with each incarnation. Human strike teams found themselves locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse, never knowing if the enemy they faced had been killed before, only to be reborn. The toll on human forces was staggering, each advance paid for in blood and sacrifice. Entire units were lost, ships reduced to drifting hulks, but they pressed on, driven by a grim determination, a refusal to let those who had fallen have died in vain. Amidst this ongoing conflict, a ceremony was held to honor the heroes of the shipyard mission. In a solemn hangar bay, ranks of soldiers stood at rigid attention, dress uniforms pristine despite the weariness in their eyes. At the front stood the surviving members of Doug's team, their faces etched with grief and pride. One by one, eulogies were spoken, the sacrifices of the fallen extolled. Posthumous medals were awarded, presented to family members with shaking hands and tear-filled eyes, and as the final notes of the bugler's lament faded away, a sense of somber determination settled over the assembly. They knew this was but one battle in a war that was far from over, that more sacrifices would be demanded before the end. Admiral Johnson took to the podium, his presence commanding even in the subdued atmosphere. He spoke of Doug's courage, of his unwavering dedication to the cause, even in the face of certain death. He held Doug up as an example, a beacon for all those still fighting to follow. But his words were not just of praise, but of warning. The road ahead would be long and hard, the price of victory steep. There would be difficult choices to make, sacrifices to endure. The Barzans, for all their losses, remained a formidable foe, and they would not go quietly. "We must steel ourselves," Admiral Johnson said, his voice ringing out in the hangar. "We must be prepared to fight and keep fighting, no matter the cost. For if we falter, if we lose our resolve, then those who have given their lives will have done so in vain. We owe it to them, to all those we have lost, to see this through to the end." As the Admiral's words faded, the assembled soldiers stood a little straighter, their eyes burning with renewed purpose. They filed out of the hangar, back to their ships and their duties, ready to continue the fight. And fight they did. In the months and years that followed, the war ground on, a brutal, unrelenting conflict that spanned star systems and consumed worlds. Human forces, battle-hardened and unyielding, clashed with Barzan holdouts and loyalist forces, each engagement a desperate, blood-soaked affair. Planets were left scarred and broken, their populations scattered and traumatized. Fleets of ships, once mighty and gleaming, were reduced to shattered ruins drifting in the void. The cost in lives and resources was staggering, a toll that would be felt for generations. Yet through it all, the human forces persevered. They fought with a ferocity and determination that surprised even their allies, driven by a resolve that would not be shaken. For they knew they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the memory of all those who had fallen, for the future of their species. In the end, there was no clear moment of victory, no definitive surrender or treaty. The Barzan Empire, once a looming threat, was left broken and diminished, its leaders scattered and its territory fractured. But pockets of resistance remained, fanatical holdouts waging a bitter guerrilla war against human occupation forces. The scars of the conflict ran deep, both on the worlds left ravaged and in the hearts of those who had fought. But amidst the ruins and the grief, there was also a sense of pride, of resilience. Humanity had been tested as never before, and had emerged bloodied but unbroken. They had proven themselves on the galactic stage, not through diplomacy or negotiation, but through sheer unyielding force of will. They had shown that they would not be cowed, would not submit, no matter the odds or the costs. And so, even as the fighting continued, as human soldiers continued to give their lives on distant worlds, there was a sense of purpose, of meaning. They were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the memory of heroes like Doug Simmons, for the future of their species. This was the legacy of the war, a legacy written in blood and fire, in courage and sacrifice. It was a legacy that would endure, that would be remembered and honored for generations to come, for in the face of the greatest threat they had ever known, humanity had stood tall, had proven themselves worthy of their place among the stars. And though the war might never truly end, though there would always be another battle to fight, another sacrifice to make, they would face it as they always had, with courage, with resolve, and with the knowledge that they were part of something greater, a story that would echo through the ages. The Retribution limped back to Earth, its hull scarred and pitted, a testament to the brutal battles it had endured. As it settled into orbit, a shuttle detached, bearing the wounded and the fallen back to the world they had fought so hard to protect. On the surface, crowds gathered, lining the streets in solemn silence as the procession passed. At its head marched Admiral Johnson, his uniform heavy with medals, his face lined with grief and pride. Behind him came the coffins, draped in the flags of Earth, each one representing a life given in defense of all they held dear. And behind them, rank upon rank of soldiers, the survivors, those who would carry on the fight. As the procession wound its way through the city streets, past the monuments and memorials to wars past, the sense of history, of continuity, was palpable. For this was not the first time humanity had faced such trials, and it would not be the last. But as the coffins were laid to rest, as the final salutes were given, and the last notes of the bugle faded away, there was also a sense of hope, of determination. For though the cost had been high, though the wounds ran deep, humanity had emerged stronger, united in a way they had never been before. And as the crowds dispersed, as the soldiers returned to their ships and their duties, there was a renewed sense of purpose, a knowledge that the fight would go on, that the legacy of heroes like Doug Simmons would be carried forward. For this was the way of humanity, the essence of what made them who they were. They would mourn their dead, would honor their sacrifices, but they would also continue to fight, to explore, to reach for the stars. And in doing so, they would ensure that the memory of those who had fallen would never be forgotten, that their legacy would endure as long as humanity itself. As Admiral Johnson stood at the podium once more, addressing the assembled ranks of Earth's defenders, his words were not of triumph or celebration, but of remembrance and resolve. "We have lost much," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Friends, comrades, loved ones, they gave their lives so that we might live, so that humanity might have a future. We must never forget that sacrifice, must never let their memory fade. But we must also look forward to the challenges that lie ahead. For though the Barzan Empire is broken, there will always be new threats, new dangers to face, and we must be ready, must be willing to fight and die as those before us have done." This is the legacy of heroes like Doug Simmons, a legacy of courage and sacrifice, of standing tall in the face of the unknown. It is a legacy that each of us must carry forward, in our own way, in our own time. So let us go forth from this place, remembering the fallen but also looking to the future. Let us continue to explore, to discover, to reach for the stars. And let us do so with the knowledge that we are part of something greater, a story that will endure as long as humanity itself. For this is who we are and who we will always be. We are humanity, and we will never stop fighting for what we believe in, for those we love, and for the future we know is possible. As the Admiral stepped down from the podium, the assembled soldiers snapped to attention, their salutes crisp and precise. And as they filed out of the assembly hall, back to their ships and their duties, there was a renewed sense of purpose, of determination. For they knew that the fight would go on, that there would always be another battle to be won, but they also knew that they would face it together, as one people, united in their resolve and their commitment to the ideals that heroes like Doug Simmons had died for. And with that knowledge they set forth, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to write the next chapter in the ongoing story of humanity's place among the stars. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.